podcast where people reach their goals and develop confidence one mind shift habit at a time. Let's join our host, certified coach Christina.
Hello. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Conversations with Coach. I am your host, certified mindset and confidence coach, Christina Callaway. I help athletes, parents, and coaches identify those areas that are hindering their performance, and together we develop the tools to increase their confidence and achieve their goals both on and off the field of play. Let me ask you a question. As an athlete, parent of an athlete, or coach, have you ever heard of or used the term mental block? I know when I was an athlete, that was what I would hear, and it was typically used to diagnose the reason I was no longer doing skills that I once did at will. Talk about super frustrating. Where are my athletes out there in the audience? I'm sure you can raise your collective virtual hand to say, that would be me, or a parent, that's my child. Well, I don't know if they or if you are like me, but I cringed whenever this was said to me or when I heard it said to someone else. Somehow, even in my young age, I knew this wasn't right. I knew that my brain wasn't experiencing some sort of physical event that would seem to fit the term mental block. Didn't know what, but I was like, I don't know if that fits me. Well, it did take me several years into my gymnastics coaching to learn I was right. Now that I am a certified mindset and confidence coach, I have been able to learn the correct term to use when describing such an event. It's actually called performance anxiety. Yep. And it happens to people more often than we even realize. What do Hugh Grant, Gandhi, and Thomas Jefferson have in common? Yeah, you're right. They're famous, very famous in their own right. But beyond their fame, they also shared performance anxiety. Hugh Grant has announced several times that he is retiring from acting because of the panic attacks he experiences when the cameras start rolling. I know, that is pretty intense. According to a 2014 article that I recently read, it was written in the Atlantics, and it talked about the article was written in um, in um, in a medium called the Atlantic. And performance anxiety is among the most widespread phobias. By some counts, it afflicts up to 20% of Americans, and a great majority of these individuals perform for a living. Can you even imagine that? Can you even imagine this is your gift, you are using these gifts, these talents to perform, and then all of a sudden, here comes that old performance anxiety. Performance anxiety can display itself in many forms of not being able to speak, the individual saying they have blurry vision, they even might shake or tremble, they might sweat. Some may even feel like they're gonna faint. So I hear you out there asking, what is the difference? What is the difference between a performance block, a mental block, and performance anxiety, and how do we overcome these? I know I'm going to give you a chance now that I've given you kind of a quick overview of what this episode is going to be about. I'm going to give you the opportunity to even share this right now with some of your friends, some of your athletes, some of your teammates, parents, some of your gym friends or sports parents, you might want to go ahead and share, because on this episode of Conversations with Coach, I will be sharing with you more information into mental blocks versus performance anxiety, and then digging a little bit deeper into the performance anxiety. So go ahead and hit the share button. If you're watching this on record, on the rebroadcast, on the recorded rebroadcast of this, make sure that you share it with individuals that you know could definitely benefit from listening to this conversation. Now, typically, I have a guest on with me, and I know you're probably waiting to hear me say, well, let me give you some information about today's guest. Well, I am today's guest. Yes, it is me. From time to time, I will just come on alone. And I felt like this topic was so important. I don't know if I'm hearing more about it just because I'm in that performance and mindset coach. I'm not really sure what it is, but what I am so very happy about is the fact that it is being talked about, it is being properly labeled, and more people and athletes are being able to overcome it. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. Mental blocks versus performance anxiety. What is the difference? Is there a difference? Well, let me tell you about some more research that I recently came upon. According to a recent article written by an individual by the name of Lane Lee, who's also a performance coach, a mental block by definition is an inability to recall a mental action, process, memory, or source of information. There are a couple of examples that I want to give to you. One is called tip of the tongue syndrome. And I just had that a little bit ago where I was trying to talk about the publication and the word publication just would not come. It was right there on the tip of my tongue and it just wouldn't come. And then there's another one referred to as threshold syndrome, but also known as the doorway effect. A mental block cannot keep you from performing a physical action. That right there in and of itself helped me to realize what I was going through as an athlete was being mislabeled. It was called a mental block, but it wasn't. A mental block cannot keep us from performing a physical action. The correct terminology for it is performance anxiety. Performance anxiety comes from unfamiliarity, a lack of confidence, an unwillingness to change one's pattern of behavior or learn new skills, and an aversion to accepting the discomfort of trying something new. Also known as an aversion for getting comfortable with discomfort. We've all heard that before, right? It can also come from a lack of consistent practice and performance, a failure to adopt a well-rounded training regimen, or just not taking the time to understand our fears as completely as possible. I know for me, whenever I would go through the performance anxiety, it was because I just did not want to take the time away to get a better understanding. And the other thing was mine was being mislabeled. I was being told that there was something going wrong with my brain. Practice, which you might find this next fact to be a little bit surprising, but for others, maybe not. You know, we've all heard the term, and I know that I've used it in with my gymnasts, that gymnastics is 10% physical and 90% mental. Well, it turns out that I wasn't too far off. Practice only accounts for 18% of success in sports. And an athlete needs to be well-rounded physically, mentally, that's psychologically. So when I say physically well-rounded, I'm talking about their health, mentally, psychological. Their environmental and cultural factors also need to be factored into this. That comes up to their understanding, their environmental and cultural factors. That comes down to education understanding. There also needs to be a fluidity in their methodology, them being able to be adaptable, and consistency in executing technique. Now, I will tell you that as a gymnastics coach, technique is really important to me. Like, I will hone it and hone it and hone it. And a lot of times I know the athletes are thinking, "Oh my gosh, she's more strict than the judges." Part of that is for performance in terms of how the judges are going to be scoring, but the other part is whenever learning a skill and you learn it with the correct technique in the beginning, it decreases your anxiety, it decreases your fear, because you are very much have very good body awareness. In order to have consistency in executing technique, I don't care whether it's performing in gymnastics, whether you are a football player, whether you're a basketball player, it matters not the sport. There has to be consistency in execution, and that includes the technique. Now, here's something that you might find odd. The more performance anxieties are mislabeled as mental blocks, the more the athlete or the individual will continue to be plagued by their own lack of understanding. In other words, by reminding or telling the individual that, hey, you're just having a mental block right now, that's not helpful. That's not going to help them spin out of it. So now that we know that there is a definite difference between mental blocks and performance anxiety, let's talk about some different types of performance anxiety, because I've only been talking about one in particular because that's usually the clientele that I get. But I want to make sure that you all are very much aware of the fact that there are multiple types of performance anxiety. And I'm just going to name about 4 of them. So there's stage fright. And of course, we've talked about athletic performance anxiety. There is test taking anxiety. I have that one. And don't you dare put a timer on test taking time. Woo, child. It just does something to my brain. And I get the whole sweats, I get the shaking, I get the negative talk going in. You're not going to answer these right before the time. It's just, I go crazy with it. And then there's one for interview anxiety. Now, if any of you out there recently have been going on for an interview and you're like thinking, whoa, why am I so nervous about this? It is true. That is part of a type of performance anxiety. Now, again, I just named a few. But for the sake of this conversation, I want to focus on athletic performance anxiety. Athletic performance anxiety is a fear or a worry related to athletic training or competition. I see you parents out there in the audience. You're like, that's right. This is what this is. I'm so happy to learn there is a name for this. So this type of performance has an additional concern even beyond the anxiety symptoms. So athletic performance anxiety can increase the risk of injury among athletes. It's true. Just think about it. The athlete is so much focused on the anxiety of not being able to do the skill that they are not focused on how to do the skill, right? And sports performance anxiety is also called competitive anxiety. It's incredibly common. According to a 2019 review, the estimates suggest anywhere from 30 to 60% of athletes experience it. That is a huge number. Now, while it may bring the athlete, their parents, and the coaches a little bit of comfort to know, hey, we are a part of a group of individuals, and it doesn't make us feel good. Like, this is not a group that we want to have a card. We don't want to be a card carrying member of the performance anxiety club. But there are ways to cope with this type of anxiety, and that is the great news. In knowing about the types, when you can identify the specific type that you have, then you can move toward the overcoming part. But before we get there, I do want to share maybe some causes of performance anxiety, because you're probably sitting out there going, okay, now I know the name of it. I know that it's associated with the sport. I know that it's associated with not being prepared. But here's something else. I'm that individual who likes to know, well, what causes performance and like where, why, what causes it? So there are two common causes that can affect performance. There is something called the Dodson law. And this law explains how stress and anxiety can affect performance. Basically, in a little nutshell, the athlete's performance will likely suffer if their arousal levels are either too low or too high. Again, balance is key in everything. So our stress levels need to stay in a limited range in order for us to perform well. So as an athlete, you want to take that away from this. For an example of low arousal, what this means is that maybe the sport or the activity that you're participating in, it's boring. So you might not be putting forth your full effort. This may resonate with some parents, but it also may be difficult to kind of digest, especially if your athlete has been participating in that sport for a really long time and all of a sudden they appear to be bored. There is the optimal arousal that I did mention, and this is that state of where you feel engaged enough in your sport to push yourself a bit harder than usual. But then we want to talk about high arousal, when you are in overdrive. And how this appears in sports is that you feel so stressful, you panic or freeze as a result. And in this situation, you are experiencing sports anxiety. Now, this law can be applied to any kind of performing task. So it's not just relegated to sports. It can be anything from stage rehearsal to interviewing to boxing matches, just anywhere. This law is like most laws, it applies to multiple things. So what you want to keep in mind is that everyone has a different level of stress, and a match that a teammate may find boring could actually be overwhelming for your athlete. So that's how you want to keep that in mind. Now, I mentioned that there were two causes. So another cause is the Smith and Small model. And this was first suggested in 1990, okay? And it offered one of the first multi-dimensional models of sports performance anxiety. So according to this model, there are multiple dimensions of anxiety and how they can feed into one another. So the first is the mental element. We've talked about that. The athlete anticipating how tough their match is going to be or the competition. And then they will start wondering whether or not they can win. They could also start worrying about the consequences of losing. So that's the mental aspect of it. The next one is the physical symptoms. As we become more anxious, our bodies respond through trauma response. You know, the familiar ones, fight or flight. Those might kick in when you're exhibiting the physical symptoms. And this response, again, can lead to the physical symptoms like sweating, shaking, needing to go to the bathroom, those types of things. I have athletes that are like that. It's like right before their competition, Coach Christina, I have to go to the bathroom. It's like, are you kidding? And then the third part of the Smith and Small model is the in the moment impact. So that's where the physical and the mental anxiety symptoms distract the athlete from their game, from their competition. And when this happens, it affects the athlete's ability to perform, to play. So, as we might imagine, when this happens, as the performance declines, the athlete begins to feel more worry. Their worry increases. Their anxiety about losing becomes more of their self fulfilling prophecy. Like, see, I knew that this was going to happen. And you might be asking, are there certain people more likely to experience this type or to experience sport anxiety than others? Here's something that you might be surprised to hear. The with sports anxiety and how it affects some people more than others, there you may have a higher chance of experiencing this type of anxiety if you are already living with an anxiety disorder. For example, um, there might be some other type of phobia that you might also have that's not sports related. So you might be a little bit more, or the person is going to be a little bit more prone to experiencing other types of anxiety. But here are some potential risk factors that are included. Being an athlete. If doing well in sports makes up a big part of your identity, then suffering a loss could be a large blow to that individual's self esteem. I mean, let's think about it. The outcome of a game can matter more to that individual than someone who's just playing for fun, right? Age is another potential risk factor. In 2018, there was a review that found adolescent competitors are more likely to have sports anxiety than adults. And they also tend to experience physical symptoms more often. Breaking that down even a little bit more, female adolescents who participate in sports are even more likely to experience this. And you might be saying, well, Christina, why is that? Why are those individuals more at risk? And what it is if you have a teenage daughter right now that's going through, there is just so much going through, so many changes are going on with them, that this is just like putting one more straw on the proverbial camel's back for them. Okay. Another risk factor is experience. Someone attending their first competition may have a higher chance of experiencing sports anxiety than maybe someone who's more seasoned in competing. Okay. Also, the level of the competition really doesn't seem to play a part in it. Like, there is no difference. There's no, whether it's on a local game, or if it's a non pre-championship type of qualifier, whether in gymnastics, whether it's an invitational meet versus a state competition versus a regional or Eastern, any of those, they don't seem to play that much. Whether a person is on a junior varsity team as opposed to a college player, like, there is no discrimination between any of that. So it really just has to do with it being whether it's their first time or if they have more experience as a competitor. And then another risk factor is gender. So there was another 2019 review, again, that found that girls tend to report more sports anxiety more frequently. And surprisingly enough, the study didn't, those who were doing the studies, the experts, couldn't really understand why that girls were reporting it. And what I just shared with you before, them experiencing so much going on physiologically during that time might be a reason. Girls also have a higher risk of anxiety in general, just not even sports related. And they also, the report could be that they're reporting it because there's less stigma around females reporting having, and expressing their emotions than there are for males. I am so happy to say that I see that turning, and that is really good. That is something that we definitely want to take. Um, we definitely don't want to have our boys and our male athletes experiencing these things and not creating a safe space where they can come and talk about it. So here are a few others that could potentially increase the risk for someone to have performance anxiety. I mentioned an important game, like regional, state, that creates a lot of pressure. Social expectations. So when a whole arena comes to watch the play, it's easy to feel like a single game will make or break the athlete's reputation. And this especially comes true in communities that consider sports a big deal. And so everybody's area is going to be different. You know the area in which you live in. Here's another one: helicopter parents. In child sports, parents contribute to plenty of anxiety. Sorry, parents, this is a hard one for you, but it will help. And as an athlete, it can feel mortifying for them to witness their parents screaming at an official, becoming upset with the coach, or anything like that. So just know that you're being watched by your children. But even if you behave well, if you're like, oh, that's not me, Coach Christina, I don't do any of that. But even if you're behaving well, you may worry about them criticizing, or the athlete might be worried about them being criticized for their performance in private. So I wrote an article a while back called "The Car Ride Home," and the conversation that takes place between the parent and the athlete, either after a practice or after a performance. Past failures always also put others at risk. If you've messed up in the past, those mistakes are probably kind of like circling around your head, or definitely circling inside of the mind of the athlete. And it might put the athlete in a position where they feel like they've got to, quote, redeem themselves with a better performance the next time around. And then competing by yourself, solo competition. I know I used to have some of my athletes that they were the only ones on their level. And so they would go to the competitions by themselves. And for some people, that really increases the anxiety and it hinders their performance. So we want to talk about how to overcome performance anxiety, because now I have just loaded you up with all of the information and the details about performance anxiety. Now, how do we overcome it? What are some things that we can do? Well, when I'm working with my athletes, I, of course, always emphasize positive self-talk. And that's easier said than done, especially if the conversation inside of the individual's head has just been playing over and over those things such as "you're not prepared," "I'm doomed to lose." So those types of things. So starting with positive self-talk and reframing that, helping them to become more self-confident. They'll suffer from fewer physical anxiety symptoms, and then they'll see an overall increase in their athletic performance. As a side note here, you all know that I love to read. And one of the most recent books that I read was entitled Soundtracks by John Acuff. Excellent book. And in it, he talks about, and it wasn't just written for athletes, he talks about the way that we overthink and how the way that we process and the thoughts that we think, he akin to soundtracks and it just made me think about, well, that is so true, because if I know, going through my own playlist of music, when I find a song that I haven't heard in a while, but that I really, really, really love, I will hit the repeat button because I don't want it to advance to the next one. I want to hear it again. And sometimes I will let it play through like 5 cycles before I let it go through. Well, according to John, that is exactly what's happening with us when we're overthinking. We are replaying those soundtracks. And he most recently just released a companion book, or his next book, that he wrote with his daughters, because he said that every time he would go to speak and talk about the book and soundtracks, that there would inevitably be parents in the audience that said, "This is great stuff. Can you write one for kids?" So he teamed up with his two daughters. One's in college and one's in high school. And they all three wrote a book together, and it is called Playlist. That usually resonates with the younger crowd a little bit more than soundtracks. They can identify when you say playlist. So I highly recommend getting that book and allowing your athlete to read it. Very short book, very easy read, something that they can read in just probably a couple hours or so. But it would be definitely helpful. Another tool that I like to use with my athletes when working with them is music. I know for me, music is so calming and it's so reassuring, and it takes my anxiety level way down. And you might see some athletes, like right before, they've got earbuds in, and most of the time they're listening to something that calms them down. Now, let me just do a huge pause right here. We're not always talking about music where it is water running or anything like that, because that may not work. That may cause even more anxiety for the individual. It is about making a music selection that helps to decrease their anxiety. And for some athletes, playing really upbeat, up tempo music does that for them. The bottom line is finding what music works prior to a competition. Now, I will tell you, through the music therapy sessions that I have with the athletes, this is really about helping them to relax and helping them to get more mentally focused in on their skills and being present and being in the moment. Those types of musics do have a distinct sound, and they are very low key and calming and relaxed. So I just wanted to put that out there about the music, because there's going to be different types. And then there's meditation. And I hope that we have evolved as a society so that we are not, when we hear the word meditation, we don't immediately go to chanting and that sort of thing. That is not what I work on. Meditation definitely can decrease sports anxiety. And when it comes to medication, there are so many, there is a plethora of types to choose from. And I will tell you that there is not a one size fits all. It is important to find the meditation that actually works well and that the athlete can identify from. And so some of the different types of meditation is, and when you're working on learning how to help focus, like grabbing a nearby object and focusing in on it to all the fine details of it. What tends to happen, and you can try this yourself, when you attempt to start a meditation and getting singularly focused on something, all of these distractions suddenly appear. All of a sudden, your to-do list is getting longer and longer. You're thinking about what time the next phone call is that you've got to make, all of this. But having that object to get singularly focused on helps to train the mind. The other thing that I do, that I help with my athletes when introducing them to meditation, is to be very forgiving of themselves when their mind does drift, because meditation and focus is something that is learned, and it does take a while to get into that rhythm. And then there's always professional support. There are different levels of performance anxiety. And as a performance and mindset coach, I have referred out some of my athletes to psychologists or sports psychiatrists to help them to get it into a more manageable state. So just understand that those types of therapies are out there, whether it be sports psychology, whether you're working with me. The bottom line is that sports performance anxiety is incredibly common, even among non-elite athletes, all the way up to the elite athletes. And so when you find that the emotions are running high, and they're high enough that the athlete's performance is taking a hit, that is when you know it is time to step in and bring in some intervention. And so I can hear you saying, okay, Coach Christina, you've given us all the information. We know the difference between mental blocks and performance anxiety. We know the different types of performance and anxiety. And even more specifically, we know that there is a way to overcome performance anxiety. So, what are our next steps? Well, I'm so glad you asked, and I am so glad you tuned in. If this episode resonated with you, and now you're like, whew, I understand what my athlete is going through. I understand that there's one day she's doing this amazing series on the beam, or she's doing her giant on the bars, releasing into her dismount without any trouble. And then all of a sudden she comes out of the practice and the tears flow as soon as she hits the car. And it might even have it could even be happening to your male athletes. I know I'm working with one right now that's involved in cheerleading. So again, I want to just put that out there. This is not just gender specific. It is an equal opportunity um, situation that athletes go through. So if you find that you want to get into a deeper dive, that you want your athlete to be able to talk with me to really understand and peel the layers off to move forward, that is where you call and you get in touch with me. So you know how I do it. This call to action, it's no different for me than it is for anyone else. Currently following me on my social media platforms, I encourage you to do so. You can find me. I made it really easy for you. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn at Christina Mindset Coach. And for that clarity call that I was talking about, that free 15 minutes just to really give me the specifics about your athlete, this is where you'll go. You'll go on my website and you'll select the button that says schedule a call. And I will be responding to you, and I am looking forward to partnering with you. And I appreciate you so much for joining me like you always do. So I'm not going to be exempt from the final thoughts, just like my other guests aren't exempt. The final thoughts that I want to leave with you this evening is there is a legitimate name for your athlete having the anxiety, and it is not mental blocks. It is performance anxiety, and it is so important. I want you to agree to partner with me to change the language. Because as I shared with you previously, reminding or telling the athlete that they have a mental block, which is very negative and it doesn't match what it is, that is instilling that mindset in them that they are broken and that there's a possibility that they can't be fixed. And that is not the case. There is help for performance anxiety, and I am here to help you. And I want to thank you again for joining me on this episode of Conversations with Coach. And I look forward to seeing you the next time, same place, same time. Until then, make it a great one. And just remember, your life is only as good as your mindset. We'll see you the next time. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Coach. Please be sure to follow Coach Christina on all of her social media platforms. And remember, life is only as good as your mindset.